a courtroom divided by hate, one black child stands alone. When the judge asks why he came, the boy looks up with tears and says, "Please help me." What happens next will leave the world in tears. The old Victorian house at the end of Maple Street had seen better days, its paint peeled in long, curling strips. The front steps sagged slightly to the left. The fence that once stood proudly around the property now leaned at awkward angles, as if too tired to stand straight anymore. This was home to 8-year-old Jamal Evans and his mother, Lydia Evans. It was not much, but it was all they had left since Jamal's father passed away 2 years ago. Every morning, Jamal would wake up to the sound of his mother getting ready for her first job of the day. She would be out the door by 5 a.m. to clean office buildings downtown, return briefly at 3 p.m. to check on Jamal after school, then head out again for her evening shift at the local diner. Her hands were always rough and cracked from cleaning chemicals. Her eyes carried permanent shadows beneath them. But whenever she looked at Jamal, they still managed to shine with love. "We are going to be okay," she would tell him each night before bed, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands, as she tucked him in. "Your father would be so proud of how brave you are." Jamal believed her. He had to, but he also saw the stack of past due bills that grew taller each week. He noticed how she would serve him dinner but claim she had already eaten, though her stomach sometimes growled loudly enough to betray her lie. He understood more than his mother realized. Their neighbor, Mr. Hargrove, owned the large, immaculately maintained house next door. His lawn was always perfectly manicured, his car always gleaming in the driveway. From the moment the Evans family had moved in 5 years ago, Mr. Hargrove had made his feelings clear. "Property values," he would mutter loudly whenever Miss Evans was within earshot. "This used to be a good neighborhood." At first, it was just cold stares and thinly veiled comments. Then came the complaints to the city about minor code violations at the Evans house, violations Miss Evans could not afford to fix. Soon Mr. Hargrove began throwing his trash over the fence into their yard. He would call Jamal derogatory names when Miss Evans was not around to hear. "Your kind do not belong here," he had told Jamal just last week, eyes narrowed with contempt. "This is my neighborhood." Then came the legal notice. Mr. Hargrove had filed a formal complaint with the city, citing the Evans home as a public eyesore that was bringing down property values. He was demanding their eviction. That night, long after she thought Jamal was asleep, Miss Evans sat at their kitchen table and wept quietly. Jamal watched from the shadows of the hallway, his small fists clenched at his sides. They had nowhere else to go, no relatives to take them in, no savings to find a new place. In the dim light of their kitchen, Jamal made a silent promise. He would not let Mr. Hargrove win. He would not let his mother down. Somehow, some way, he would save their home. For the past week, Miss Evans had been working even longer hours. She had taken on a third job cleaning hotel rooms in the afternoons, between her morning office cleaning and evening diner shifts. Her body ached constantly. Her fingers had developed cracks that sometimes bled when she washed dishes. The extra money helped, but it was still not enough to catch up on months of back rent and mounting utility bills. "You look tired, Mom," Jamal said one morning as she prepared to leave before sunrise. Miss Evans forced a smile. "I am just fine, baby. Mrs. Johnson next door will check on you after school. There is peanut butter and bread for your lunch." She did not mention that the bread was the last in the house, or that they were down to their final jar of peanut butter. She kissed his forehead and headed out into the darkness. When Jamal returned from school that afternoon, he found 3 garbage bags dumped on their front porch. Rotting food and broken glass spilled across the worn wooden boards. A note was taped to their door. "Clean up your trash. This is what your house looks like to the rest of us." Jamal recognized Mr. Hargrove's handwriting. This was not the first time. He spent an hour cleaning up the mess before his mother returned, not wanting her to face this after her long day. Mr. Hargrove's harassment had grown more frequent and bold since filing the eviction complaint. He had gathered signatures from other neighbors, claiming the Evans house was a neighborhood hazard. He had called the police twice, making false noise complaints when the house had been completely silent. He had even confronted Ms. Evans directly in the street, loudly proclaiming that people like you bring crime and filth wherever you go. That night, Jamal pretended to be asleep when his mother checked on him. Once she was gone, he crept to the hallway and heard her on the phone in the kitchen. "I cannot afford a lawyer, Sandra," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The eviction hearing is in 3 days. Mr. Hargrove has 3 neighbors as witnesses. What can I do? We have nowhere else to go." After she hung up, Jamal heard the muffled sounds of her crying. He silently returned to his bed, but sleep did not come. Instead, his mind filled with questions. Why did Mr. Hargrove hate them so much? What would happen if they lost their home? Where would they go? The next morning, Jamal noticed the eviction papers on the kitchen counter. The hearing was scheduled for Friday at 9 a.m. at the county courthouse downtown. His mother had circled the date repeatedly, pressing the pen so hard it had torn the paper. At school, Jamal was quiet. During lunch, he went to the library instead of the cafeteria. He used the school computer to search for information about eviction hearings. The words were big and confusing, but he understood enough. Someone would decide if they could stay in their home. Mr. Hargrove would be there to say bad things about them. His mother would be alone. But his mother would not be at the hearing. She could not miss work, or she would lose one of her jobs. Jamal overheard her on the phone that evening, begging her boss for time off and being denied. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for the opportunity. I will be there on Friday." When she hung up, Jamal saw the defeat in her shoulders as they slumped forward. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice through tears. That night, Jamal made his decision. If his mother could not go to the hearing, he would go instead. He was only 8, but he knew what was happening. He knew Mr. Hargrove was lying about them. Someone needed to tell the truth. Thursday night, Jamal packed his backpack while his mother slept. He put in his father's old camera with the photos he had secretly taken of Mr. Hargrove dumping trash in their yard. He added his notebook where he had written down every mean thing Mr. Hargrove had said to them. He included the threatening notes Mr. Hargrove had left. Finally, he added the drawings he had made showing their house and Mr. Hargrove's house next door, with arrows pointing to all the things Mr. Hargrove complained about, but never helped fix. Friday morning, Ms. Evans left for work at her usual time, kissing Jamal goodbye and reminding him to go straight to school. "I love you more than anything in this world," she said, holding him tight. "No matter what happens with the house, we will be okay as long as we have each other." Jamal nodded, hiding his face so she would not see his determination. As soon as she was gone, he put on his cleanest clothes, a button-up shirt his father had bought him that was now too small, and his only pair of jeans without holes. He combed his hair neatly and grabbed his packed backpack. Instead of walking to school, Jamal headed downtown. He had memorized the bus route after studying it in the library. His stomach growled fiercely. He had not eaten breakfast, saving the last of the food for when his mother returned home tired and hungry. The morning was cold, and his jacket was too thin for the early spring chill. Still, he walked with purpose, his small shoulders squared against whatever might come. The bus driver gave him a curious look when he boarded alone, but Jamal had practiced his story. "My mom is meeting me at the courthouse. She had to go early for work," he explained confidently. The ride downtown took 45 minutes. Jamal watched the neighborhoods change through the window. Houses like theirs gave way to taller buildings, then eventually to the imposing stone structures of downtown. When he stepped off the bus, The county courthouse loomed before him like a mountain. People rushed past in suits and professional clothes. No one paid attention to the small boy climbing the massive stone steps, his backpack clutched tightly to his chest. Jamal's heart pounded. His legs trembled with each step. But he thought of his mother's tears, of Mr. Hargrove's cruel words, of their home, the only place where he still felt his father's presence. And he kept walking. What would you have done in this situation? Comment your thoughts below. The courthouse security guards exchanged glances when Jamal approached the metal detectors. One bent down to his level. "You lost, little man?" he asked, not unkindly. Jamal shook his head. "I have a court hearing. Evans versus Hargrove. Room 204. The guard looked skeptical, but checked his clipboard. Finding the case listed, his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Where are your parents, son?" "My mom has to work. She cannot miss work or she will lose her job. I came to tell the judge the truth." Something in Jamal's serious expression made the guard pause. After a moment, he nodded and helped Jamal through security. "Room 204 is on the second floor, down the hall to the left," he said, pointing to the elevator. Jamal thanked him politely and headed toward the elevator, his legs still shaking but his resolve unbroken. He was hungry and scared, but in his mind the alternative, losing their home, was far worse. The elevator seemed enormous, all polished brass and dark wood. Jamal had to stretch to reach the button for the second floor. As he rode up, an older lady in a dark suit noticed him. "Are you here all alone?" she asked, concerned. Jamal nodded. "I have to save our house." The woman seemed about to say something else, but the elevator doors opened, and Jamal hurried out. He followed the signs to room 204, his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. Outside the courtroom, a long wooden bench held several adults waiting for their cases. Mr. Hargrove sat among them, looking smug in a crisp suit and tie. He did not notice Jamal at first, giving the boy a chance to slip inside the courtroom undetected. Inside, the room was cavernous, high ceilings with ornate moldings, rows of wooden benches. At the front, a raised platform where the judge would sit. Jamal found a seat in the back row, making himself as small as possible. He watched as a Mr. Hargrove stood frozen, his face turning a deep shade of crimson as the evidence of his actions was displayed for the entire courtroom to see. The photographs Jamal had taken with his father's old camera were now being passed among court officials. Clear images of Mr. Hargrove throwing garbage onto the Evans property, vandalizing their mailbox, and even removing a "for sale" sign from another neighbor's lawn to place it in front of the Evans home. "Mr. Hargrove," the judge said, his voice carrying a weight that filled the silent courtroom. "Would you care to explain these photographs?" Mr. Hargrove straightened his tie nervously. "Your Honor, this is clearly some sort of misunderstanding. The boy is obviously confused. These photographs show you deliberately dumping trash on the Evans property," the judge countered, holding up one of the images. "Do you deny this is you in these pictures?" Mr. Hargrove shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Well, I was simply cleaning up the neighborhood. Their property is an eyesore, as I mentioned earlier." "By adding more trash to it?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "That seems counterproductive if your concern was truly about neighborhood cleanliness." The courtroom remained silent as Mr. Hargrove struggled to respond, sweat now visibly beaded on his forehead. "And these notes," the judge continued, holding up the threatening messages Jamal had collected. "Is this your handwriting, Mr. Hargrove?" "I may have left a note or two about property maintenance," Mr. Hargrove admitted, his voice noticeably weaker than it had been at the start of the proceedings. "It was merely a neighborly reminder." The judge read one of the notes aloud. "Your kind ruins everything you touch. Get out before things get worse." "Would you characterize this as a neighborly reminder, Mr. Hargrove?" A murmur swept through the courtroom. Mr. Hargrove's attorney leaned over, and whispered something urgently in his ear, but Mr. Hargrove brushed him aside. "Your Honor, you do not understand what it is like having these people next door," Mr. Hargrove blurted out, his composure cracking. "My property values have plummeted. Everything I worked for is being destroyed by their presence." "Their presence," the judge repeated slowly. "Not the condition of the property, but their presence specifically?" Mr. Hargrove seemed to realize his mistake too late. "I meant the condition of the property, of course." "Mr. Hargrove, the court has reviewed Ms. Evans' tax and property records. Despite financial hardship, she has paid her property taxes on time, even if occasionally late. She has responded to every official citation from the city regarding repairs, filing for extensions when necessary." The judge leaned forward. "What specifically about the Evans family's presence concerns you so much?" Mr. Hargrove's face contorted with frustration. "Just look at them. Look at what they bring to the neighborhood. Before they moved in, everyone on our street was—" He stopped abruptly, but the implication hung heavily in the air. "Everyone was what, Mr. Hargrove?" the judge pressed. Mr. Hargrove remained silent, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape. "Let me ask you something else," the judge continued. "Are you aware that harassment based on race or color is a violation of the Fair Housing Act?" "I never said anything about race," Mr. Hargrove protested weakly. The judge held up Jamal's journal. "According to the documented incidents in this journal, you told this child, and I quote, 'Your kind do not belong here. This is my neighborhood.' Would you care to explain what you meant by 'your kind'?" Mr. Hargrove's lawyer stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client would like to withdraw the complaint against the Evans family at this time." "It is too late for that," the judge replied firmly. "Mr. Hargrove, this court finds your testimony not only inconsistent, but deliberately misleading. Your actions, as evidenced by the material presented today, suggest a pattern of harassment motivated by discriminatory intent." Mr. Hargrove slumped in his chair, the facade of righteous indignation completely collapsed. The courtroom doors burst open. Miss Evans rushed in, still wearing her cleaning uniform, her eyes wild with panic. "Jamal!" she cried out when she spotted her son. "Oh my God, Jamal!" She ran to him, embracing him tightly, then pulled back to examine his face. "The school called me when you did not show up. I have been looking everywhere for you." "I had to save our home, Mom," Jamal explained, his voice small but steady. "Mr. Hargrove was going to make us leave." Ms. Evans looked up at the judge, mortification and fear on her face. "Your Honor, I am so sorry. I did not know he was coming here. Please do not hold this against us." The judge's expression softened. "Ms. Evans, your son has displayed remarkable courage today. In fact, I believe everyone in this courtroom could learn something from him." For the first time, Ms. Evans seemed to notice the atmosphere in the room. The court reporter was discreetly wiping tears from her eyes. The bailiff stood straighter, looking at Jamal with unmistakable respect. Even some of the spectators waiting for other cases had moved closer to offer supportive nods to Ms. Evans. A woman in a tailored suit approached them. "Ms. Evans, my name is Diane Mitchell. I am an attorney with the Housing Rights Coalition. I would like to offer our services, pro bono, not just for this case but for any housing issues you might face in the future." Another person stepped forward, an older gentleman with kind eyes. "I own the hardware store on 5th Street. I would be happy to donate materials if you need help with home repairs." A middle-aged woman joined them. "My husband is a contractor. We can help with the work, no charge." Ms. Evans stood speechless, one arm still protectively around Jamal. "I do not understand," she finally managed to say. The court clerk came over with a tissue for Ms. Evans and a glass of water for Jamal. "Your boy showed us all what real courage looks like today," she said gently. "Sometimes people just need a reminder of what matters." The judge cleared his throat, regaining the attention of the courtroom. In the matter of Hargrove versus Evans, this court finds in favor of the defendant. The eviction notice is hereby invalidated. He struck his gavel once, firmly. Mr. Hargrove stood, his attorney tugging at his sleeve. "But, Your Honor—" "I am not finished, Mr. Hargrove," the judge interrupted. "Based on the evidence presented today, this court is ordering an investigation into your actions for possible violations of the Fair Housing Act. Until this investigation is complete, you are to maintain a distance of at least 50 feet from the Evans property and family members." The judge then turned his attention to Ms. Evans and Jamal. "Ms. Evans, I am connecting you with our court social worker who can help you access resources for home repair assistance, food support, and legal aid. No one should have to work 3 jobs and still struggle to keep a roof over their family's head." Ms. Evans nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Additionally," the judge continued, "I am referring this case to the county's Community Dispute Resolution Center. They will work with all parties to ensure an equitable solution moving forward." As the judge prepared to move on to the next case, Mr. Hargrove's attorney approached Ms. Evans. "My client would like to offer a settlement," he said quietly, "to cover repairs to your home and compensation for the distress caused." Ms. Evans straightened her shoulders. "Tell your client I do not want his money. I just want him to leave us in peace." As they gathered their belongings to leave, several people approached Ms. Evans with business cards, offers of help, and words of support. A community that had been invisible to them just hours before was suddenly emerging, ready to stand beside them. A local news reporter had slipped into the courtroom and was now asking if Ms. Evans would be willing to share their story. "People need to hear about this," the reporter urged, "about what your son did and how this community is responding." Ms. Evans looked down at Jamal, who seemed both exhausted and somehow taller than he had been that morning. "What do you think?" she asked him. "Should we tell our story?" Jamal nodded slowly. "Maybe it will help other people like us, Mum." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Ms. Evans holding Jamal's hand tightly, the morning sun broke through the clouds. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Ms. Evans felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. 2 weeks had passed since the courthouse hearing. The Evans house on Maple Street looked different now. Fresh paint in a warm yellow covered the once peeling exterior. The sagging front steps had been rebuilt, sturdy and level. The leaning fence stood straight again, with colourful flowers beginning to bloom along its base. On Saturday morning, a small army of volunteers moved around the property. Some repaired the roof, while others replaced broken windows. Ms. Mitchell from the Housing Rights Coalition coordinated the efforts, clipboard in hand, as she directed deliveries of donated supplies. Inside, Ms. Evans and Jamal stood in their kitchen, which now had functioning appliances and cabinets that closed properly. "I still cannot believe this is happening," Ms. Evans said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. Jamal looked up at his mother. The dark circles beneath her eyes had begun to fade. Her hands, though still bearing the marks of years of hard labor, were healing. She was working only one job now. The diner had promoted her to assistant manager after her story made the local news. The flexible hours meant she could be home when Jamal returned from school. "Dad would be happy," Jamal said simply. Ms. Evans nodded, pulling him close. "Yes, he would be. And he would be so proud of you." Through the window, they could see Mr. Hargrove's house. It stood empty now. After the fair housing investigation had begun, 3 other families in the neighborhood had come forward with similar stories of harassment. Mr. Hargrove had quietly put his house up for sale and moved away, leaving behind a community that was now healing from the divisions he had fostered. The doorbell rang. It was Judge Wilson, the same judge who had presided over their case. He had started making regular visits, checking on their progress, and bringing books for Jamal, who had developed an interest in law. "Good morning," the judge greeted them warmly. "I brought something I thought you might like to see." He handed Miss Evans an official-looking document. It was a new court directive, establishing the Evans Protocol for eviction cases, a requirement that all housing disputes involving families with children would receive priority review by a housing advocate before proceeding to formal eviction hearings. "Your case has changed how we handle evictions in this county," Judge Wilson explained. "We are also implementing a new community service program that connects struggling homeowners with resources before their situations become desperate." Ms. Evans read the document with disbelief. "You named it after us?" "After Jamal, actually," the judge corrected, smiling down at the boy. His courage revealed gaps in our system that many of us had been blind to for too long. Later that afternoon, as the volunteers gathered for a community meal in the newly repaired backyard, Ms. Evans watched her son moving confidently among the people who had become their extended family. The hardware store owner who had taught Jamal how to use a paintbrush, the contractor's wife who brought him books about architecture, the court clerk who was tutoring him after school. This was more than charity, Ms. Evans realized. This was community in its truest form, people recognizing their shared humanity and responsibility to one another. A young reporter who had been following their story approached, notebook in hand. "Ms. Evans, many people are calling what happened a miracle of community spirit, but others point out that your situation highlights systemic issues, how racism and poverty create barriers that no amount of individual effort can overcome without structural change. What do you think?" Ms. Evans considered the question carefully. "I think both are true," she finally answered. "What Jamal did was brave beyond measure, but he should never have needed to be that brave. No child should have to fight for basic dignity and security." She looked around at the transformed yard, the repaired house, the community that had come together not just to fix broken windows, but to begin mending broken systems. "The miracle is not that people helped us," she continued. "The miracle would be building a world where such help is not necessary, because everyone has what they need to begin with. Until then, we must look out for one another." The reporter nodded thoughtfully. "And Jamal? How is he processing all of this?" They both glanced over at the boy, who was carefully showing a younger child how to plant a flower. "He is learning that speaking truth, even when your voice shakes, can change things," Ms. Evans said. "But he is also learning that he should not have had to be the one to speak that truth. Adults should have protected him, should have seen what was happening long before it reached that point." Judge Wilson joined them, having overheard the conversation. "That is why I have been meeting with city officials about implementing broader changes," he said. "Jamal's experience has become a catalyst, but the responsibility for change lies with those of us who have the power to create it." As evening approached and the volunteers began to depart, Jamal sat on the new front porch swing with his mother. They watched the sunset painting their neighborhood in gold and purple. "Are we going to be okay now?" Jamal asked, echoing the question his mother had answered so many times before. Ms. Evans looked at her son, this child who had carried burdens no child should bear, who had shown courage that had humbled a courtroom full of adults, who had somehow maintained his gentle spirit despite everything. "Yes," she answered with genuine certainty for the first time. "We are going to be more than okay." The story of Jamal Evans reminds us of truths we too often forget. That dignity does not depend on a person's address or bank account. That justice sometimes requires us to hear voices we have systematically silenced. That communities have power when they choose connection over division. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that no child should ever have to be as brave as Jamal was that day in the courtroom. Children should be protected, not protectors. They should be nurtured, not tested. They should be believed, not doubted. When systems fail our most vulnerable, those failures reveal not just individual prejudice, but collective responsibility. Mr. Hargrove's hatred existed within a framework that allowed it to flourish, a framework of apathetic neighbors, overwhelmed social services, and courts designed for those with resources to navigate them. The true measure of our society is not found in our tallest buildings or strongest armies. It is found in how we treat our Jamals, the children who stand trembling but determined, asking us simply to see their humanity. Every day in courtrooms, classrooms, and communities across our nation, children like Jamal are fighting battles that adults created. They inherit our prejudices, our systems, and our failures of compassion. Yet somehow, they still find the courage to believe in a better world. The question is not whether we are moved by their courage, but whether we are moved to action by it. If this story resonated with you, please share it. Let us ensure these important stories never go unheard. For in the sharing, we acknowledge our responsibility to create communities where dignity is not something to be fought for, but something freely given to all.